Imagine you're in the back seat of a vehicle that's driving along a segment of highway approaching a 90-degree left turn. So that red dot is you sitting in the back seat of this van, and then this blue dot is your friend who's sitting, if we zoom in, all the way against the side wall of the van, okay? Now, the law of inertia says that the van would like nothing more than to keep going in a straight line. Okay, so whatever speed the van has would like to maintain that in a straight line. But of course, when the van gets here, it won't be facing forward. It'll make its way around the curve. So maybe at some point, the van ends up in this position. So let's just see. Here. Now, let's imagine that the coefficient of friction between you and the seat is nearly zero. Maybe it's like you're wearing a tracksuit, and it's a bench seat in the back of this van that's made out of some sort of cheap leather. So it's really slippery. There's no force of friction to guide you at all. There's really just the law of inertia. You just want to continue to move forward. So your friend would have otherwise been here when the van's in that position, but because they're making contact right here with the sidewall of the van, then that can present a normal force to push them inward this way. And so, thank goodness they don't end up out here. Instead, your friend is going to be in this position because they're being pushed by the side of the car. But you're not being pushed by anything. Like I say, imagine a case where it's really slippery. So the law of inertia says you want to continue in a straight line, and so you end up here. So I could see how passengers in a car might get confused and think that there's some sort of a centrifugal force, right? Because after all, how could you end up farther toward the outside and slide across that back seat? Well, you didn't really slide outward. You just followed the law of inertia, trying to continue forward. But from this point on, you won't continue to move in a straight line because now you're making contact with the person next to you. And so just as the side of the car pushed them inward toward the center of the circle, now they're pushing you inward toward the center of the circle. So once a centripetal force is available for all the objects, oh, and by the way, there's a centripetal force for the car too, right? Its wheels are made out of rubber, and they contact the highway, and so friction is providing a centripetal force on the car. So there's a normal force from the side of the car pushing inward on your friend that points toward the center of the circular path. So there's their centripetal force. Your friend pushes on you, that's your centripetal force, and friction pushes on the car. So as long as everything has a centripetal force, then the car or the van can continue to round the curve, and at all points every object has some force that's pointing toward the center of this circular or just a fraction of a circular path. Okay, so yeah, indeed, don't get duped into thinking there's a centrifugal force. If anything, the law of inertia would want to lead things in a straight line, but as long as there's some force pointing toward the center of the circle, then you can overcome the tendency of inertia and the object can accelerate. And we're not saying accelerating by changing speed. Maybe the vector that represents how fast the van is going is always the same length, but it's certainly changing direction. Now maybe the question goes something like this: what's the maximum speed that the vehicle can safely round the curve? We know if you go too fast, then there's not enough friction between the road and your tires to allow you to follow the curve. And instead, if you've ever driven on an icy road, you know what happens if you go too fast on a curve. You do end up obeying the law of inertia, right? So yeah, what's the maximum safe speed? Well, we need to know a few things. First of all, you need to be given the radius of curvature of the road. So let's make up a value. Say the radius of curvature is 90 meters. Okay, and then let's make up another value, and this isn't too unrealistic. Let's say the coefficient of friction between the tires and the road is equal to 0.95. By the way, that's actually a coefficient of static friction that allows you to follow a curve on a road. Now that might not make sense, right? You say, wait a minute, when I'm driving around a curve, I'm in motion. That should be kinetic friction. But if you think about the way a tire rolls on the road, at some instant in time, the contact point between the tire and the road is right here. And the tire rotates in this counterclockwise direction if the car is driving with a velocity here. And so eventually the tire is going to be here in this position, and the point that was originally in contact with the road back here, that point on the wheel is now up here, and a new point of contact is established. But as long as your car doesn't skid or slide, it's always rolling and laying down a new point of contact, but at any instant, the relative velocity between the wheel and the road is equal to 0, unless the tire starts to slip. So yeah, it's actually static friction that's involved in guiding your car on the highway. Okay, so yeah, what would the maximum safe speed be? So that's the aerial view. Let's look at a side view of this. If a car were driving all the way around a curved track, when it gets right here, the road pushes up, there's normal force. Gravity pulls down, there's mg. And then it's that grip with the road, it's that static force of friction that pushes the car inward. And so friction points toward the center of the circle. So friction is not center fleeing, friction is a center seeking force, which means it's a centripetal force. Okay, so centripetal force is not a force in and of itself. The frictional force is the centripetal force. It's not as if there's an additional force pointing toward the center of the circle that we name centripetal. No. The friction force is pointing toward the center, so the friction force is a centripetal kind of a force. The normal force and mg cancel each other out, so the net force is the force of friction. So mass times acceleration is force of friction. But this acceleration now we see is a centripetal acceleration. And remember from previous chapters that centripetal acceleration can be calculated as v squared over r. So mv squared over r is equal to force of friction, which is the coefficient of static friction multiplied by normal force. But the normal force in this case is just as large as the pull of gravity. So we have mv squared over r is equal to mu mg. So interestingly, it doesn't matter what type of vehicle is rounding the curve. The maximum safe speed is the same for light vehicles, just as it is for heavy vehicles, as long as they all are driving with tires made of the same sort of rubber, so that the coefficient of friction is the same. Mass cancels out of the equation. Multiply both sides of the equation by r, and we have v squared equals mu gr. So the safe speed is the square root of mu times g times r. So last step here, we can make this a numerical example, and the maximum safe speed would be 0.95 multiplied by 9.8 meters per second squared times 90 meters. Notice the units are going to be meters squared per second squared, but we're taking the square root of all this. So let's see, 0.95 times 9.8 times 90 is about 838. The square root of that is just about 29 meters per second, which would be roughly 65 miles per hour. Any faster than that, and there's not enough friction to provide the necessary centripetal force, and then the car would be governed by the law of inertia, and instead of rounding the curve, would fly off tangentially.